Now, I called this very short talk, Parents and Carers Helping Teenagers Grow. And that's really what it's about. And as Judy said, one of the things that I've been particularly struck by, and I suppose my sort of input to this, is one of my areas of interest is research on parenting teenagers. And I've been sort of discussing really with Judy, well, there's an awful lot going on in this area, and I think this is really relevant and can be useful for foster carers. So that's really what I want to explore a little bit here. I also want to say just a little bit about the teenagers themselves. We've heard from Billy, and Billy, I think, and indeed the Minister, has sort of raised some very important questions about it, what it's like growing up as an adolescent in this country, what it's like being in care. So what I want to do is, first of all, just say something about the research on parenting, because I think this really matters in this discussion that we're having today. The first thing to say is that in the last 10, 15 years, actually there's been a big boost in this area. There's been a lot going on and a lot of interesting and exciting things. I think that's partly, as you can see here, I've said, it's partly neuroscience. I mean, it is partly the fact that we're getting so much more information about brain development in adolescence, and that's raised an interest in this life stage in a different way, I think. But it's also true that social psychology has really been focusing on the family, but particularly the family with teenagers. And there are a number of examples of this. Certainly some of the work around attachment. I'm not going to say anything about attachment because I know other speakers are going to be mentioning this, but attachment in the context of foster care is absolutely central. What sort of relationship can a foster carer and a young person expect to make? What sort of attachment is going to happen there, particularly, as the Minister said, where so many young people will have had other placements and so on. And there's a lot of work and thinking to be done there. I want to talk a little bit about autonomy promotion, about how do we provide the help for young people to become independent, to move, as the Minister said, into independence. As both Billy and the Minister mentioned, there are huge challenges around the media. How do young people navigate the digital world? And that's particularly critical in the foster care situation. And then I also think there's a lot of research around new family forms, research on divorce and step parenting. One of the things I would like to sort of put as a challenge really is when we're thinking about the relationship between the foster carer and the teenager, there's actually some very interesting stuff about, for example, step parents and teenagers, about live-in partners and teenagers. Some of the interesting research that's going on new and diverse family forms is actually very relevant to the sorts of relationships that can be made between foster carers and teenagers. So those are some of the things I just want to draw your attention to. But also, we need to match that. That needs to be brought together with some of the research on adolescent development, on teenagers themselves. And quite a lot of that has, I think, already been discussed by Billy and by the Minister. So the whole issue about negative stereotyping, judging young people because of their age, not because of who they are, the issue of connectedness and separation and how that happens, particularly in the foster care situation, the need for autonomy and independence. Billy mentioned the peer group, and that's a really critical issue. Where does support come from for these young people who experience many different settings, many different contexts for growing up? The peer group is very important. The other adults, social workers, carers, and so on, and then the digital world. So all those things really are, now obviously I don't have time to talk about those, but they're all alive issues in terms of research. So what I decided to do, since I've only got a very short amount of time, is to take two closely related examples. And at the end, I will show you, well, I will identify some very interesting research so the students in the audience can follow some of this up. And I've chosen two things. One is this issue of how do you balance providing emotional support with providing the control that's necessary, the structure, which we know is part of effective parenting. in adolescence. Without the structure, without the boundaries, young people do really struggle. So how does the carer, how does the adult who is living, helping, supporting this young person, how does that person balance providing the emotional support and providing the control? And the second thing I want to talk about briefly is autonomy promotion. There's a lot of research at the moment about autonomy promotion, about how is the best way for an adult to promote autonomy in adolescence, in other words, to get them to be able to move to that next stage, the independent stage, but keep them safe and provide the protection. So those are the two things I want to talk about very briefly. So let's talk about control first. There's quite a lot of very interesting research, as I said, around at the moment about this issue of the adequate control, providing the adequate and appropriate and sensitive control versus moving into what might be called coercive control or psychological control. So people define adequate control as providing appropriate boundaries, being demanding, in other words, being clear with the young person that there are expectations, not just letting them do anything. What are the expectations, both in the house, in relationships, at school, and so on? Unless we communicate with young people what our expectations are, unless we're demanding in the sense of setting goals, how will young people know if they're doing well or not? Providing supervision, of course, and providing the absolutely essential protection. So that's the adequate. Now, the coercive control, or the sometimes called psychological control, involves very different things. Being overprotective, the adult is extra anxious, very worried. I once talked to some parents who had had terrible trouble with their 14-year-old. What did they do? They decided to lock her in her bedroom because she was running away. She shinned down the drain pipe and got out that way. So you can't lock young people up, but that sort of response is sometimes there. Being intrusive because you're worried, because you're over-anxious. All these things, rejection, shaming, disrespect to the young person, and withdrawal of love. Now, these sound very extreme, and all of us would say, well, we don't do that sort of thing. But when we're, as adults, and I've had 4 teenagers, so I know, when you're really anxious or depressed or feeling you're losing your grip, it's actually quite difficult to hold on to the adequate control, the appropriate control. And we sometimes do slip into these less appropriate, less effective ways of providing control. And some of the interesting research now is looking at the balance between adequate and coercive. How far do we go, particularly when we're pushed, when we're anxious, when we feel we've got a responsibility to keep this young person safe, and yet they're not responding, they're running away, they're doing all sorts of things that we don't want. So making this balance work is very, very hard. It's hard with, as you said, it's hard with teenagers where they've been in the same family with their biological parents all their lives. It's much harder with young people who've had many different experiences, many different adults. So that's one topic, but of course it's closely related to this thing about autonomy. Because what if we are going to help our young people become healthy adults, we have to promote autonomy in them. And this is a struggle that all parents of teenagers have. How do we provide those opportunities for young people to become autonomous? And broadly speaking, of course, actually, I think in this country, we keep our teenagers as children too long. We don't give them enough responsibility, and that's particularly true in the foster care situation. So some of the research is looking at the different types of autonomy. So you've got autonomous thinking, helping young people be, to think for themselves, to make decisions themselves, decision making. Autonomous behaviour in the home. What sort of things are they doing in the home which are really, taking responsibility? Are they contributing? Are they cooking a meal? Are they helping in other ways? All that's part of autonomy. And then, of course, autonomous behaviour away from the home. Now, it's very, very difficult to do this. And a lot of us as adults, as parents and carers, we don't think enough about how we can encourage this autonomous behaviour. We like to hold our teenagers as children. We like to hold them safe. We like to keep them in our own control. Now, it's very important to say that age and being age appropriate is absolutely critical here. It's critical for control, but it's also critical for autonomy. So clearly, you know, there's a big difference between what promoting autonomy would be for a 12 or a 14-year-old for what it would be for a 16-year-old. But of course, promoting autonomy can start, you know, very early. We can do all sorts of things with a 12-year-old to start them thinking about how they're going to start taking control of their own lives. And those will gradually develop, they'll gradually widen out and so on. But these are absolutely central things. Just think, for example, about health issues. Now, health issues are really, this is another area I'm really interested in, but that's a really critical area where autonomy is central. Do you go to the doctor with your young person? When you go to the doctor, are you sitting in there with the doctor, making sure you're listening to what's happening? If the young person you have is on some form of medication, are you always running around saying, have you taken your pills, or whatever it is? What help are we giving young people to develop autonomous behaviour? And that's a real challenge for everyone, and it's a particular challenge, I think, for foster carers, particularly in the context of the delegated authority and the sorts of issues you've been talking about. Very, you know, really important to be clear about what is age appropriate, but this is a really big theme. So these are two examples, I think, of research on parenting which can be applied in the context of foster care. Now, I wanted to really just end on a positive note and identify one other area of research which I've really been struck with recently. And this very much relates to what Billy was saying about how young people are judged. Personally, I'm very concerned about the negative stereotyping, as I call it, the judgment that is made about teenagers, and the problem that, broadly speaking, you know, we do in all sorts of professional and personal settings, we do have a real difficulty in seeing and identifying the positives. I think that, you know, there is a real issue here that we have to address. I think Judy, when she was talking to Billy, said, well, what can we do about it? And he said, well, we can, you know, have more community service. You know, young people being involved in communities, that's certainly part of it. But one of the things that I've been very struck with is the sort of increase in awareness of what's called a strengths-based approach. Sometimes people call it an asset model. It's linked to a much greater focus on resilience. But the strengths-based approach is really, really interesting. And when I show the references, I'll show you something that just came out last year, which is called strengths-based practice. And that's looking at social workers, psychologists, and other professionals who are using a very different... So what's happening really here is identifying, really working to identifying the strengths that the individual young person brings. So not saying these are the problems, he's using drugs, he's you know, got unsuitable friends or whatever it is, but let's start by looking at what positive things this young person can bring. What assets, what capabilities does this young person have? And it's very, you know, this is a completely different way of thinking about things. And I am really sort of struck by how this is becoming much more common. It's definitely, you know, there's definitely some good research, but it also seems to be really getting into practice. So I wanted to end on that, talking about autonomy and control as two examples, but I wanted to end on this positive note that the negative views, the judgments that we make about young people as a society, but also in the professional capacity, has to be shifted. We have to be thinking in a much more positive way, and I think a strengths-based approach is really, really important. So I did put some references here. You can see the first one is a whole journal issue on strengths-based practice, and although that isn't in your packs, it will be available to everyone. one afterwards. So I will stop there. It's really, I suppose, just to conclude is what, just very briefly, I wanted to, I mean, this is what we're doing here, just to read it out again, applying research from parenting to foster care, and we are applying research on adolescence to teenagers in care. That's the job of this seminar series. And what I wanted to do now was just really to highlight one or two things that I think are exciting examples of ways in which research and current research findings can be applied to the foster care situation. And I really hope that that's sort of rung a bell with some people, and I look forward to talking about it further with you later. Thank you very much indeed.